Welcome everyone to this evening's Sheldon Lecture. Actually the first of two Sheldon Lectures which are being presented this year. It's presented by the Sheldon Memorial Trust in happy association with the University of York's Open Lecture Programme, whose organisers we gratefully thank. And one of them, Naomi Richards, was right here, and she's missed out on the thanks. So sorry, Naomi. We're thrilled that through a combination of subject and speaker, it's proved to be a complete sellout, and we're only sorry to have disappointed many would-be attenders. But a video of the talk will be accessible in due course via our website. Now, on practical notes, I fear I have to say, please silence your mobile telephones. Thank you very much in advance. And I have the pleasure of inviting you all to join us for a glass of wine in the foyer after the talk and after the questions at the end of our speaker's lecture. Now, who was Sheldon? Why Sheldon, you may ask? The roughly annual lectures arranged by the Sheldon Trust honour the memory of a man called Oliver Sheldon, who was director of Rowntree's, and in the middle years of the last century, he played a crucial role in the founding or development of certain cultural institutions in York, notably the York Georgian Society and the York Civic Trust. However, probably the most important aspect of his work was that he was instrumental in laying the ground for what was ultimately to become the University of York. That opened 12 years after his death, so he never saw it, and it's where we are precisely today. This evening's lecture is, I think, the 16th in a series launched in 2008. Their biographical subjects being figures who've contributed significantly to the cultural or intellectual life of York, mostly in the 20th century, but occasionally stepping back in time to the 19th. Appropriately, the first subject was Oliver Sheldon himself. Our talk today is slightly different in approach, in that it is not devoted to a single person, but to a whole family, the Backhouse family of nurserymen and nursery women. And a confession to make here, we confess that we've been backwards in coming forwards in finding good female subjects for our series of talks, but we're certainly hoping to remedy that. There could be no one more appropriate than Professor Gillian Parker to speak on this subject of the Backhouses, and we were delighted when she accepted our invitation to do so. Gillian's background is as a researcher over many years in health and social care policy, most recently directing the Social Policy Research Unit in this university, where she is now Professor Emerita. Since retiring, and I use her own words, she has been trying to turn herself into a garden historian. Gillian completed a postgraduate diploma in garden and landscape history at the Institute of Historical Research at London University in 2020, where her work included writing a history of the gardens designed by George Dilliston at Goddard's, the home of Noel and Kathleen Terry on the Tadcaster Road. Since 2021, Gillian has been a postgraduate research student in the Department of Landscape Architecture at the University of Sheffield, her subject being the social, economic and horticultural history of the Backhouse Nursery at York. She's perhaps unique in being able to bring social science skills to garden history. Gillian is a trustee of the Yorkshire Gardens Trust and a member of its research and recording group, as well as a keen volunteer gardener at Goddard's. In between all of that, she tells us, she tries to keep her own garden in reasonable condition. Now that might sound like a cue for a different lecture in the future, but this evening we look forward enormously to hearing Gillian talk about the backhouses. Please everyone, join me in warmly welcoming our speaker.
I'd just like to start this evening with some initial thanks to the Sheldon Memorial Trustees for giving me this extraordinary, wonderful opportunity to talk about my research on the Backhouse Nursery. To Richard for his wonderful introduction and for shepherding me through the preparations for the talk today. To Naomi Richards, who has disappeared again, I think, but who's providing technical support tonight. And I probably ought to mention Jan Woudstra, who is my long-suffering supervisor at the University of Sheffield. And to thank all you as well for coming to hear me. There are many more people who've helped me on my path to this lecture tonight, and I'll acknowledge them at the end of my talk. So the quotation which opens my presentation tonight is from a 19th century gardening newspaper reporting the annual outing of the Manchester Horticultural Improvement Society in July 1889. That year's destination was the Backhouse Nursery of York, and their rave review of the visit signals the existence of this important plant and tree nursery that had been in York since 1815. Yet 15 years after the Manchester gardeners visited, the firm was in serious financial trouble. And by 1922, it was effectively bankrupt. A new company was established then, ending any link between the Backhouse family and the nursery. Just why and how the nursery became internationally famous hasn't been fully researched so far, although there are various narratives about its establishment, about the roles of the Backhouse family members who were involved in its development, and about its eventual demise, and we're going to talk a bit about those tonight. This plaque is on the house in Micklegate that Thomas and James Backhouse occupied not long after they first came to York from their home in Darlington in 1815 to establish the business, and the plaque tells one of these narratives. We've got James at the top with a description of what he was, botanist, nurseryman, missionary, while his older brother, Thomas, gets only a passing mention at the bottom. And we have the images of gentians, an alpine flower. The nursery's eventual fame was closely tied to their expertise in discovering, growing and hybridising alpine plants and in creating the rockworks on which these plants could be grown in the UK. So what might a passerby think if they looked at this plaque? Well, first, perhaps they might assume that while James was a nurseryman, his brother Thomas wasn't. Secondly, they might conclude, if they recognise the plant, that James, whose name is cradled by the gentians, was instrumental in creating the nursery's reputation for alpines, or perhaps that as a botanist, he discovered the plant. And thirdly, perhaps a feminist passerby might wonder whether there are any women in the Backhouse house who also lived there, and if so, what role they played in the history summarised here. Unlike the case with some other successful 19th century nurseries, there's no business archive for the Backhouse nursery, so exploring its development depends largely on working from the general and horticultural press and scouring the catalogues of likely archives, trying to find references to backhouses. Since the blue plaque was erected in 2017, digitisation of the general and horticultural press, of archive catalogues and of family history records has opened up a very large space in which I've been able to study the nursery, using archival remnants scattered across the country alongside press reporting. This process is still ongoing, so my narrative also tonight remains partial. However, what I now know what I now know shows that the plaque obscures facts about other significant individuals, and I'm going to aim today to shine some light on those people. I also hope that I'll convince you of just how important the Backhouse nursery was by exploring the different contributions of the various family members and others who were involved. First, I need to do a bit of ground clearing, and then I'll go on to discuss the relative contributions of the three Backhouse men most closely associated with the nursery, and talk about the end of the link between the family and the nursery, and finally, I hope to come to some sort of conclusion. First, we just need to clear some ground by saying which Backhouses we're talking about. Studying this large and important Quaker family isn't made easy by the tradition of naming sons after their fathers. There are at least 6 Jameses in direct line of descent, but this very simplified tree starts here with this, I hope you can see this, yes, this James here, who was a linen weaver and then established a bank, which his sons, Jonathan and James, went into when they were of an age. It's this James here who had the sons James and Thomas who came to York. This James died relatively young, and James and Thomas, I suppose, had to find their way in the world and came to York. James's son and grandson, also called James, also then in their turn ran the nursery. So to avoid confusion, when it's not absolutely obvious from the context, I call them James the elder, James the younger, and James the youngest. I discovered fairly early on that calling them James the first, second, and third just confused people completely. And if we get into James the father and James the son, then we're in entirely the wrong sort of area. Thomas Backhouse's son, so this Thomas here, his son was didn't enter the nursery business, but he became a shipbuilder in the northeast of England. So there was no ongoing connection between his branch of the family and the Backhouse nursery, although there is a small re-entry later with Arthur Henry Burt, which I'll talk about later on. However, Caroline Thompson, who with her husband now runs the Backhouse Rossi estate in Fife, is Thomas's great-great-great-granddaughter via his elder daughter, Mary. Here, I can get the mouse to go. There we go, yeah. So she has revived the family interest in the nursery trade. A second source of confusion is that there were many other Backhouses who were interested in botany and plant breeding. Narcissus enthusiasts here tonight will know that there are many Backhouse named Narcissi and others bred by Backhouse family members. These you can see on the left of my slideshow in the very creative shade of yellow. They were related to the nursery Backhouses. This William here was the first cousin of James and Thomas. And then their various children and grandchildren. But perhaps the most famous of them is actually Sarah, who was a Backhouse by marriage. And the final bit of ground clearing is to say that when I later refer to monetary values, these have all been converted to modern 2022 values using an average earnings index, which is recommended in the pioneering work by Roderick Flood, who's sort of started looking at the economic history of gardening. So, having sorted that all out, you're ready? James the elder, James the younger, and James the youngest. Okay. But Thomas and James didn't start the nursery from scratch when they moved to York. They bought the successful nursery of the Telford family, who'd been operating as nurserymen since the end of the 17th century, with a base in Tanner Row in York, and who, as we see here, passed on the business with their blessing and with their existing staff. John Harvey, who's a historian of early nurseries, demonstrated some years ago how the Telfords underpinned landscape development in the north of England in the 18th century by supplying and planting trees for many of the most important estates across Yorkshire and the northeast. My research has been able to look in a bit more detail than Harvey was able to, looking at the Telfords family history, landholding and operations, in order to understand the business that the Backhouses acquired. Telfords was clearly a substantial operation. It had sites across the 3 historic ridings of Yorkshire and an elite and wealthy clientele, one of the most important perhaps being the Lascelles at Harewood. This slide shows a Telford's bill for roses, a cherry tree, bean and pea seeds and garden tools sent to Mr Turnbull, the Harewood steward. Backhouses took on some of these clients when they took over the nursery, supplying, as Telfords had done, forest trees, fruit trees, seeds, all the things you would expect a nursery, and also acting, as many nurseries did, as an employment agency for gardeners. So Thomas and James bought a significant and successful business when they moved to York. But who was the driving force in developing the nursery once it was bought from Telfords? Almost all the existing narratives and the blue plaque imply that James was the key player, but I think my research suggests otherwise. For reasons partly to do with his health and the belief that an outdoor occupation would help, alongside his passion for botany, James undertook a brief period of training to become a nurseryman in his early 20s. He worked for 2 years in what I now know to be another Quaker-owned nursery, Mackey's, in Norwich. There's a memoir of James that his sister Sarah wrote based on James' autobiographical writing. And in this he says that after this short apprenticeship, he looked around for opportunities to establish a nursery in Darlington. However, having heard about the Telfords selling up, he decided to move to York. Feeling that taking the nursery on would be difficult and demanding, James says that he asked Thomas to join him. This has been taken in the received narrative to suggest that Thomas was in some way a lesser partner in the initiative. However, I found a letter in the Horticultural Press that says that Thomas was already running a nursery near Darlington at this point. So it was he who was the experienced nurseryman in the partnership. Further, as the advert I showed you earlier implies, both men, still only then in their early 20s, depended on the experience of the nursery workers that they took on from Telfords. And it seems possible that the last John Telford involved in the nursery was also available to help the young Backhouse men, as he continued to live in a house on the Tanner Row nursery site until his death, when Thomas apparently moved into the same house. This image of the house is from the Hugh Murray archive held at York City Archives, but I'm afraid there's no information with the image about where it's from. So if anybody thinks they know, I would love them to tell me later on. Once the business was theirs, James and Thomas moved to York, first taking lodgings and then a house in Micklegate. They were followed by their widowed mother Mary and 6 siblings. Thomas and James experienced great personal losses in their younger years. Their father died when they were aged 8 and 6, respectively. Their elder brother died a year later at the age of 17. Another sister died as a baby when Thomas and James were still children. Their eldest sister died 2 years after the move to York. The sister next in age to James died in 1824, and their youngest sister in 1829. And then James's wife, Deborah, and their third child died in 1827, and Thomas's first wife, Hannah, in the same year. While this pattern of family deaths possibly wasn't unusual at this time, I believe it had a substantial impact on James. He'd already embarked on extensive travels to Quaker meetings across Britain before his wife's and daughter's deaths. But in what I think a modern perspective might recognise perhaps as unresolved grief, he increased these visits and travels after their death. And then in 1831, he embarked on a 10-year missionary visit to Australia and South Africa. And in doing that, he left behind 2 young children in the care of his frail mother and his sisters Sarah and Elizabeth, and of course Thomas, his brother. James gives rather a sanguine account of this in his autobiographical writings, saying that Thomas and his other relatives supported his wish to travel to the other side of the world, despite the responsibility for his children that they would have to take on for a long period. However, letters from James to his deceased wife's family paint a different picture and throw light onto another so far untold part of the Backhouse story. In 1831, James wrote to another James Bevington Lowe, his wife's half-brother, explaining the arrangements for the care of the children that he was putting in place. The original plan, he says, had been for his youngest brother Joseph, and I expect his wife, to care for the children, but this hadn't happened. Joseph had disappeared from York before James embarked on his voyage, making it necessary to alter the arrangements for the children's care. At that point, James was on a ship on the way to Australia, and he didn't know which family member the children were with, but writes that he had given Thomas complete charge of his affairs and made him the children's guardian. In the end, it was James's sister, Elizabeth, who took up the care of James the younger and his sister, also called Elizabeth, just to add to the confusion. Now, not long after I embarked on this research, I found a press notice announcing, also in 1831, the year that James the Elder went to Australia, the dissolution of a partnership between Thomas, James and Joseph Backhouse, tanners. And to be honest, I discounted it at the time as some kind of error, perhaps caused by the fact that the nursery had its offices on Tanner Row. But it sort of lurked at the back of my mind as something to explore later, wondering if Joseph perhaps had also been involved in the nursery. However, I later came across an advertisement of 1833 for an auction of all the furniture and other contents of Plantation House, late in the occupation of Mr. Backhouse, and a notice that the house and the garden were to be let. Enquiries about both could be directed to Thomas Backhouse. I discovered, looking around, that Joseph had lived in Plantation House, shown here some years later, but still with the Plantation House and still with the tannery down the side there. And indeed, he had been a tanner. So his decision not to care for James's children, and it seems to leave York, explained both the dissolution of the partnership that I'd seen and been a bit confused about right at the beginning of all this, and the sale of the house contents. Joseph apparently returned to the northeast and eventually became a coal owner, but it's been difficult to find out much else about him. But I do know that he made some donations of specimens and a book to the Yorkshire Philosophical Society, and he did attend James the Elder's funeral. So turning back now to James the Elder and his fugue to the other side of the world, everywhere he visited he did botanise in between his missionary work, and he sent home dried specimens and seeds to Kew, to Edinburgh Botanic Gardens and to the Nursery in York. And some example of his discoveries, some of which have been renamed since and some of which are a bit difficult to track down in terms of modern terminology. I love that acacia, I think it's so pretty. And then there's two that actually were originally named after him because he was seen to have discovered them. However, while James was away, and probably before, it was Thomas who drove the development of the nursery. Their catalogues always named the company as T and J Backhouse, and Thomas was seen almost universally as the nurseryman, as these excerpts from the Horticultural Press show. So we've got here a Craspedia glaucus sent by Mr. James Backhouse to his brother, in whose nursery at York it flowered in April last. And this one about the mysterious wisteria, which has never been seen since, it was sent home in a very flattering character by good English botanist Mr. Backhouse, brother to the celebrated nurseryman of that name at York. So clearly, contemporaries thought that Thomas was the nurseryman. And why wouldn't they? You know, James is the other side of the world and had been away for 10 years. So it's not surprising, really. But as well as keeping the nursery going while James was away, Thomas was engaged in all sorts of other activities which provided infrastructure for development of the business. He was involved in the very earliest railways and instrumental in bringing the railway to York. And his role in that has been completely obliterated, more or less, by the hoo-ha around George Hudson. But he was very important. He went to London to campaign for the bringing of the railway and so on. With other Quakers, he helped to establish both a bank and an insurance company in York, run on mutual principles. And he was also a director of the York Flint Glassworks at the top of Fishergate, which I think is a pretty shrewd connection for a man whose business depends on glass houses. But he wasn't just a financial whiz kid. He was clearly involved in the day-to-day running of the nursery. These fragments are from the archive for Rudding Park. And here we see him in 1835 enticing Sir Joseph Radcliffe with the autumn catalogue of trees and shrubs. And who hasn't been enticed by an autumn catalogue of trees and shrubs? And he displays his expertise in a little note appended to the catalogue saying it's impossible to make a good appraisal of a country when it's raining. He recommends someone who could lay out the ground well and cheaply, and he offers to make contact with that person on Sir Joseph's behalf. He was also a social campaigner. He was involved in debates about the condition of the working classes and of enslaved people who'd been emancipated in British colonies. He campaigned for the registration of land and property ownership and for increased probity in financial and political life. And I sometimes do wonder whether we might invite him back. He provided his expertise to various medical charities in York, and he was also involved in the Yorkshire Philosophical Society. He subscribed to the building fund for the museum, as well as to the purchase of Audubon's book, Birds of America. And he was for several years the curator of entomology, and his greatest contribution was his donation in 1831 of his entire collection of 1,500 insects. And then in 1835, he spearheaded the purchase of another successful nursery in York, that of the Riggs of Fishergate, to replace nursery land that was being given up in Tanner Row when the railway was on its way. Those of you who live in York will probably know about the tragedy that the Rigg family experienced in 1830, when 6 of their 8 children were drowned in an incident on the River Ouse. This monument to their memory was restored by the York Civic Trust a few years ago. But not long after this accident, and following the death of John Rigg, the children's father, the nursery and its associated lands and houses were put up for auction and were bought by Thomas. Purchasing the Riggs nursery and most of its land as a going concern allowed Backhouses to transfer the customer-facing side of the business to Fishergate. And as this map shows, the site was substantial, and it provided a base not too far away from the centre of York. There was other land further down what's now Fulford Road and on the other side of Fulford Road. Backhouses were in Fishergate for about 20 years before consolidating all their activity at Holgate, 8 years after Thomas's death at the age of 53 in 1845. There was an advert in December 1853. It told customers that the nursery had built premises at Holgate and would be carrying out all their business from there in the future. Some have assumed from this that the firm moved to Holgate for the first time in 1853, but that is absolutely not the case. There are newspaper reports and other evidence that show that Backhouses had taken on Telford land at Holgate when they bought the nursery, and that they ran that land as a nursery with attendant gardeners at least as early as 1827, and therefore probably from the very beginning. And the first Ordnance Survey map of York, I'm sorry this is a very grubby version, but it's the only one that's available on the National Library of Scotland site. This was surveyed just after Thomas's death, and it shows clearly that the Holgate site was a functioning nursery well before 1853. We can see a large and developed nursery with ornamental and more functional beds, and we've also got a smattering of glass houses. That's a glass house there. There's some glass houses here, and this may or may not be a glass house here. I'm not quite sure about that one. So Thomas must have managed this before while James was away. But what happened when James came back? Well, he came back in 1841, so almost 10 years after he'd left. But he also almost immediately began journeys across England and Wales to other Quaker meetings. As Sarah's memoir puts it, with wording that I think is worthy of the best diplomat, even after his return from the 10-year journey, James was seldom long together without feeling his mind drawn in gospel love towards some part of Great Britain. I think, in other words, he couldn't keep his feet under the table. Thomas's son from his second marriage was too young to take over his role in the nursery after his death. And in any case, it seems that Thomas had been nurturing James the younger's interest in the business. James the elder reported that after his son took over running the nursery, he readily made way for his father's absence on gospel errands. And at this point, James the younger was only 19 or 20 years old. And when he wasn't travelling on religious work, when he came back, the elder James was also involved in prodigious feats of writing. He published the very long account of his Australian travels only 2 years after he returned, and that of his journey in Mauritius and South Africa, which he visited on his way back from Australia. That was published only a year later, drawing on the detailed diaries that he'd kept. He wrote on religious subjects throughout his life. He wrote many letters, and when he visited Norway on missionary visits in 1853 and 1860, again kept detailed diaries. He threw himself into work supporting the school he'd established for poor children when he was in South Africa, and in other practical and religious work related to South Africa. But interesting, it was Sarah who kept the accounts for the school, and on whom he said the care respecting it chiefly devolved. In fact, the idea for the school had been Sarah's, and she had, by the end of 1839, already raised the modern equivalent of £191,000 in donations to establish it, and secured over £95,000 in regular subscriptions. When he was at home, James campaigned for abstinence from alcohol and for the abolition of church rates, both of which also involved much letter writing. And he also had a bit of a reputation for writing to people whose behaviour he considered remiss in some way. One of these letters, however, throws extraordinarily interesting light onto James. He and Sarah had been out one day and they'd come across someone they knew in an intoxicated state. And he writes to this person saying that he himself had struggled with alcohol, and that while he had been enabled with God's help to put the decanter away, as he says, the temptation continued and remained a subject of prayer to the time of writing. So I think this throws yet more light onto James's need to be continually on the move. Indeed, in the year his wife died, in another letter to his brother-in-law, he said that when he couldn't carry out his religious visits, he felt the necessity of watchfulness as much as I think I ever did in my life. I think he was really brave to confess to this struggle with alcohol in letters to others. But it's not an issue that I think, to the best of my knowledge anyway, has appeared in accounts of his life so far. So given the amounts he did write, it's surprising that he wrote so little about plants, other than those described in the accounts of his long journeys. An article about Tasmanian plants, written while he was still away, was published in John Claudius Loudon's garden magazine. Loudon was a really influential horticultural writer in the first half of the 19th century. And in a footnote to James's article, he expresses the hope that once James was home, there'd be more of on the natural history and gardening of Australia. But Loudon and the rest of the horticultural world were largely disappointed in this. Apart from some correspondence, there's little other evidence to date of extensive horticultural or botanical writing. And that's all the more puzzling as he went to great efforts to record the plants he'd seen at various points on his extended journeys. This page is from his log of the plants he saw when he was visiting Norfolk Island in the Pacific Ocean. And I think that is his pressing of a bit of grass that he wasn't able to identify. So taking all this activity together, and he was still botanising in Britain, it's difficult to believe that he had much time left for helping his son to run the business. Indeed, it's clear from writing that it was James the Younger who continued to develop the nursery. He became a nursery manager soon after leaving school, and he built on the foundations that his uncle Thomas had provided. But this responsibility came at a price. Taking charge of the business after Thomas's death for one who was described as young and of a highly sensitive nature was said to have proved almost too much and had an impact on James the Younger's health. He visited Ben Ridding Hydropathic Establishment on more than one occasion for rest and change. And this suggestion of ill health is evident in other accounts of James the Younger and throughout the whole of his life. So in looking at the success that James the Younger created at this cost to himself, I'm going to concentrate on two of the most important features. First, there's the linked elements of alpine plants, fern and rock gardens, and secondly, plant introductions. The main witness for the importance of James the Younger is William Robinson, one of the most influential garden writers of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. In 1864, he published a three-part account of a visit to the Backhouse nursery, with particular praise for the fern houses and rock gardens. Given that Robson was often a grumpy commentator on contemporary garden styles and very unlikely to admit to ignorance on any horticultural matter, this article is little short of astonishing. Among the wonders Robinson saw was the fern house, which is illustrated here, with its 70 tons of massive stones used in its construction. Down one side, apparently, there was a charming little cascade, half hidden by ferns at its margins, and these flowed into a small pond. As Robinson asks, who would not be charmed by such a scene? And among the many ferns he mentions, he says that the specimen of the New Zealand silver tree fern is probably the finest specimen in Europe. The next wonder was an underground home for filmy ferns, a subterranean glen created with 120 tons of sandstone, but without any need of bricks or cement because of the natural way that the stones were placed. And it had a really sophisticated heating system that allowed ferns needing different temperatures to be grown within the same space. And it provided a continuous gentle mist that generated moisture but didn't dampen the leaves of the plants to such an extent that they would have been damaged. There was a roof of iron bars holding glass plates which let in just enough light for the growing of these very sensitive ferns. Robinson says that this was the most remarkable and interesting garden structure in England. After walking past acres of fruit trees, herbaceous and alpine plants in the main nursery area and the frame yard, Robinson came to the final wonder of his visit, the alpine rockery. This he describes as like a very charming and well-selected little bit of Wales or Cumberland, with its cliffs and ravine, little lake, rocky island and gloomy gorge complete. It was, he said, utterly unlike and infinitely superior to any of the compositions known as rockwork that he had ever seen. Don't you wish you could see such an array of horticultural wonder today? Alas, you can't. Not a hint of it remains above ground. But there are some contemporary photographs, originally on glass plate negatives and digitised by the Borthwick Institute of Archives here. And these give a hint of what so impressed Robinson. And these were most likely taken towards the end of the 1880s and into the beginning of the 1890s. When I first saw this image, I found it difficult to believe that it was a photograph of anywhere in York. So convincing is the rocky treed landscape, surely near the top of a mountain somewhere, but Holgate it really is. And this snowy scene adds to the illusion of the alpine scene, makes it even more convincing. And these other photographs show closer images of the planting close to the lake, on the left-hand side there, and on the right, planting near a path. But the nursery continued to develop after William Robinson's visit. And this Ordnance Survey map, which was surveyed just after James the Younger's death, shows how much had changed in the 45 years between Thomas's death and James's. We can see the office buildings just here that where William Robinson started his visit. But we can see there's a lot more glass work, a lot more glass houses than there had been in the earlier map, both at the top and at the bottom of the nursery, and also over here on the left-hand side. And this is the rock garden here. This is West Bank. This is the house that was built for James the Younger and his wife Mary. And this is where the rock garden was. And here are the two pools and the little stream that ran between them. And if the technological gods are with us, we might be able to see something very interesting. Keep your fingers crossed. Talk among yourselves. Yeah, there we go. Okay, so on the left-hand side of this image, we've got a fragment of that 1890 map that I just showed you. And on the right here, and yes, good, my mouse is moving on both at the same time. This is a LiDAR image, which is an image which is taken by an aeroplane flying over the ground and sending down laser signals. And this is a surface map, so it shows the surface. So this is where the glass houses were. I think this is now the church of the Latter-day Saints. There were glass houses here. This is where the rockery was, you can see here. This is where the lake was. There's houses now here. The other lake was here, another little lake here. And of the glass houses, almost nothing left. There is a tiny, tiny bit of something over here, which may be where the laboratory was. But you can see how little of it is left to see. So these images emphasise that about how much we've lost, really. All that's left really is the West Bank Park. And if you just follow the thing around, you can see, I'm following the 1890 map here, but you can see that the Backhouse planting of trees probably does still exist in large part, including this clump here, which is sort of quite surprising, really. It survived. So, turning on now to the rock gardens, establishing just when they started laying out rock and alpine gardens for other peoples remains difficult. I have to close this down, I think. Yep, there we go. And that was the emergency one in case the technology didn't work. Okay. Backhouse catalogues had included plants with alpine origins right from the earliest years, but the first specific mention of alpine plants in the title of a catalogue may have been around the middle of the 1850s. This catalogue is from later, it's from 1867, and it refers to a previous one of 1865. And it's worth pointing out that William Robinson's book, Alpine Flowers, which garden history largely credits with having stimulated 19th century interest in alpine planting, wasn't actually published until 1870. So backhouses were into the alpine planting and the alpine game, if you like, well before William Robinson. The earliest rock garden that I can confidently date is this one started in 1867 for J.H. Kitson at Elmet Hall near Leeds. Again, nothing to be seen of it now. So I think taken together, these facts might suggest that Robinson's description of the rock garden at York prompted requests to backhouses from wealthy garden owners and alpine enthusiasts to create something similar for themselves. However, Elmet Hall and many of the other rock gardens that we can confidently ascribe to the Backhouse nursery at this period were actually laid out by Richard Potter and later by William Angus Clark, two other under-regarded individuals in the nursery story. Both were described as alpine managers at Backhouses at different stages, and it seems likely that Clark was trained by Potter. This is an undated photo of Richard Potter and his wife in front of their house at Charterville in Oxfordshire, where Potter moved around 1898. And at a rock conference, the Conference on Rock Gardens and Rock Plants in 1936, the nurseryman Robert Wallace said that Richard Potter had been James the Younger's able lieutenant and had constructed the York Rockwork jointly with him and trained up an enthusiastic band of foremen. Among other gardens rock gardens that Potter created, the most famous is probably Ellen Wilmot's Alpine Gorge and Filmy Fern Cave at Worley Place in Essex. This photograph is actually an Ellen Wilmot photograph, which she allowed Backhouses to include in their 1898 catalogue. Another famous one is the Alpine Garden at the Birmingham Botanic Garden. That does still exist. And perhaps the most famous one of all is the rock garden at Friar Park in Henley-on-Thames. It was made for Francis Crisp, but it became very famous again when the Beatle, George Harrison, and his wife Olivia bought Friar Park and embarked on a programme of restoration. So the second major contribution that James the Younger made to horticultural history was the introduction of many plants, and in particular the promotion of alpine plants and ferns. Before moving on to that, I just need to say a bit about the whole business about introduction of plants. Discovering, and always to be thought of as inverted commas, discovering a plant in some far or not so far-flung place was one thing, but sending it back in a state that allowed it to be grown was another matter altogether. Many plants discovered by the early plant hunters were sent back as herbarium specimens, pressed leaves, flowers, a dried root, and sometimes, if you're lucky, a seed. Nursery owners, botanic gardens, and the plant hunters that they engaged were subsequently off on a hide-and-seek mission. They were returning to places that the original discoverer said that they'd found the plant and seeing whether they could find it, but also not letting on too clearly about where they'd found it, if they had, so as not to let the competition in on the secret. And if the plant was on the other side of the world, there was then the difficult task of getting it back so it could be propagated. Therefore, it was the introduction of plants in a living state and not necessarily their discovery that was key to their appearance in gardens. We saw earlier that James the Elder sent back seeds to York for Thomas to grow, and we know that he sent young eucalyptus plants from Tasmania to Australia for the garden of Alexander Macleay, who was the colonial secretary of New South Wales. When James had been on his way out to Tasmania, he'd stopped off in Sydney and he'd seen Macleay's extensive private botanic garden. The eucalyptus trees were sent to Macleay tightly wrapped in brown paper and packed in a botanist's tin vasculum. Now, for those of you who are not botanists, and I'm not, this is what a vasculum is, or these are vascula, presumably. I'm very grateful to the Cambridge Botanic Garden for allowing me to use this. So you see they're sort of like tin boxes that things went into. I understand that they've been superseded by Tupperware boxes. When he returned to Britain, James the Elder shared advice on the best way to transport plants halfway across the world, not in expensive Glaswegian cases at all, but as seeds, wrapped and suspended in the passenger's cabin, halfway between the floor and the ceiling, so as to avoid the warm humidity of the vessel so they didn't start sprouting on the way home. However, he advised even in the 1830s and 40s, seeds were probably best sent back by the post. Nurseries often reintroduce plants as well that have been lost to cultivation. This plant, for example, was flowered by Backhouses in 1871 after a long absence. It had been discovered in the 1840s but had disappeared from cultivation in England until reintroduced, as the Curtis Botanical magazine noted, through those indefatigable horticulturists, the Messrs. Backhouse. And this illustration was actually produced from a specimen produced by the nursery. The history of plant discovery, of course, has a dark side that involves both colonial and environmental exploitation. This saw plants hunted to extinction, dug up in their thousands, and sent back as growing plants rather than as seeds or cuttings. And this was particularly the case with orchids as they became fashionable from the mid-19th century onwards. But James the Younger was aware of the dangers of over-extraction of plant material, and that's shown in his correspondence that he initiated with Asa Gray. Gray was professor of botany at Harvard in the USA and is considered perhaps the most important American botanist of the 19th century. This is him on the left with his wife, and Joseph Hooker, the director of Kew, looking a bit grumpy, I think. The first approach was actually from James, and it was about, this is the first letter he sent to Asa Gray, and it was about trying to find seeds or plants of American native plants that he'd seen in Gray's own botany of the northern United States but hadn't been able to track down in Britain. He wondered whether Gray might be open to sharing seeds or roots of them from the university's botanic gardens. These are 3 of the plants that he was hoping to find, though again some of them have subsequently changed their names. This is Gray's botany in the middle. James, in this first letter, referred to his own collection of hardy perennials and alpine plants, which he described as perhaps scarcely equalled in this country, and said that he would be happy to send several plants of great beauty that might be new to American growers. As a postscript, perhaps to underline his credentials, he said he was well known to the keeper of the herbarium at Kew and also to its director. Gray responded with some seeds of the requested varieties and others, and in return James sent a collection of alpine and herbaceous plants direct to Boston via a Cunard steamer. The correspondence between the 2 men went on for at least 14 years, and it established a botanical and horticultural exchange relationship with Gray and the Harvard Botanic Garden. The horticultural exchange developed a commercial edge that saw Gray finding plant hunters and passing on payments to them on Backhouse's behalf. Nonetheless, the correspondence grew into a friendship. Gray, his wife and daughter stayed with James and his family when Gray attended the British Association meeting in York in 1881, a visit which James later described as something to remember with gladness forever. And one of the last letters to Gray included this painting that James had commissioned of an alpine plant that Gray had sent some years previously and which was now growing well at York but without a name. He was hoping that Gray might be able to tell him what he was. From the earliest letters, James talked about the dangers of overexploitation of plant material and expressed anger at what Gray had told him of the local destruction of a plant at the hands of someone who professed to be a botanist. And James acted as a conduit between Gray and Kew Gardens, sometimes sending things from Gray onto Kew when he felt that they fitted their collection better than the nurseries, but also things Gray had always intended for Kew. And there's some quite funny stuff in the correspondence about James' anxieties about Kew's ability to propagate and keep plants alive, which is a bit serious, really, for Kew Gardens. And it meant that Backhouses actually established the Gray material before sending them on to Kew. I say James expressed concern to Gray about Kew, saying that while Dr. Hooker was earnest and energetic enough, he was not well supported in the gardening side of things, with the result that many fine things were lost there. And there's a very well, to my mind, a quite funny thing at the end where he says, ask Gray to ensure that this thought did not come back across the Atlantic on any account. This correspondence is the only long run of letters of James the Younger I've been able to find so far, but I think they're really important because they convey something of his character, as well as providing an insight into nursery practice. Throughout, James the botanist shows a keen interest in the plants as plants, but James the nurseryman is also concerned about their eventual commercial value. And several times he explains to Gray in the letters just how long it can take to get a plant to a stage where it's ready for sale. He laments the loss of plants sent across the Atlantic because they haven't been well packed and gives advice about how it can be done better next time. He's also apologetic when the nursery has not managed to propagate material Gray has sent. James funded the plant hunters generously, and he was also keen to recompense Gray for material sent from the Botanic Garden and the time he'd spent organising the plant hunters. At the same time, however, James stressed that while he was happy to pay the expeditions of an expedition to find a Lewisia, this had to be on the understanding that he would have a monopoly on it, and that while he had no objection to plants going into the Harvard Botanic Garden, he did not want the plants to go out of the garden and towards others who might use them commercially. There's a 5-year gap in the correspondence, unfortunately, and some of the letters are clearly missing, and I've not so far come across any of Gray's replies to James the Younger. But based on the information that is present, James the Younger spent the modern equivalent of £197,000 on plant hunting in North America via Gray. So we see in these letters then something of the nursery's search for new or at least novel plants to develop for commercial sale. But their efforts in this extended far beyond North America, with introduced and imported plants hailing from South America, South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, North Africa, and from alpine regions in countries across the whole of Europe and the Himalaya. The latter of these often brought in by Richard Potter. And in one of the more surprising finds of my research, I discovered that while Pycnostachys urticifolia had been so-called introduced in Kew in 1899, in fact, a slightly tetchy editorial in the Gardener's Chronicle points out that it had first been sent home to Backhouses in 1861 from Mount Zamba by Dr. Livingstone. It was flowered the next year, and it was illustrated in the Botanical magazine in 1863, which is where this illustration is from. Now, I promise that this is my only recourse tonight to my previous life as a quantitative social scientist. The number of first introductions from Backhouses listed in the horticultural press is impressive, and it shows clearly the influence of the younger James. If you bear in mind that James the elder died here in 1869, so clearly, I guess some of it was chance, but I guess also it was having the brakes taken off a bit, perhaps. So we can see the influence of the younger James there. But the introductions almost ceased after his death, James the Younger's death in 1890. Other press references to the Backhouse nursery also reduced from this point. So what are we to make of this sudden drop in introductions and press references? Well, as I mentioned earlier, James the Younger was considered rather frail for most of his life. But what form did that frailty take? In 1884, in the last of his letters to Asa Gray to have survived, he recalls a visit to the Pyrenees the previous year, where the family had gone in the hope of their younger son William's health improving. He recounts a climb to 5,000 feet above sea level with James the youngest son, where he says that they were cruising among the sharp crags of the ridge and botanising to their heart's content. He was out for 58 at this point, so it doesn't to me suggest a man in poor physical health. However, in the last years of his life, it seems that he was not in full command of the sharp intellect of his earlier years. A contemporary account refers to a fall sustained 2 years before his death and the possibility that this injured his brain. The writer, though unnamed, clearly knew James the Younger very well, and he says that little by little this injury narrowed the sphere of his interests and by its very nature withdrew him more and more from those who loved him best and made communication infrequent. His death certificate mentions fatty degeneration of the brain and epilepsy. But as with modern death certificates, we don't know if he died with these things or because of them. To the modern ear, fatty degeneration perhaps suggests some form of arterial sclerosis, and the account of his final years might hint at a form of dementia. But whatever the cause, I feel that this late image of James with Mary on the right-hand side here, compared with the earlier but undated one, suggests a loss of the essence of the man. William Robinson became a close friend of James the Younger, and he accompanied him on hill walking expeditions in the north of England and Wales to see British alpine plants. And he wrote a really moving obituary for James and dedicated the 38th volume of his magazine, The Garden, to him. And later he dedicated the 3rd edition of his influential book, Alpine Flowers. I'm very grateful to Peter Williams for that reference. I believe that Robinson learned much from James the Younger that made its way into Alpine Flowers, so the dedication was entirely appropriate. So, who took up the reins during these final years of James the Younger's life? He and his wife Mary had had 4 children, 2 of whom didn't survive into childhood. There were thus only 2 likely Backhouse successors as the head of the nursery, James the youngest and Mary Louisa. Times being what they were, the successor was unlikely to be Mary Louisa, although it's clear that she was an intelligent and active woman. There's little in the historical material so far that suggests that James the youngest leapt in to manage the business in his late teens in the way that his father had done. He was at school until the age of 17, and the 1881 census, when he was 19, doesn't record an occupation for him. It wasn't until 1884 that he was granted the status of Freeman of York by birthright, but not as a tradesman, as an apprentice, and he was 22 by that stage. In his own account in 1925 of his credentials as a landscaper, He refers to 30 years of experience, which would suggest an introduction to that aspect of the trade not much before the age of 30. But the nursery did become his. His father's will bequeathed it to him alongside a sizable amount of both real and personal estate, amounting about £16 million in modern terms. The house and the land lying to the east of a dividing line that ran down the nursery from one end to the other was left to his mother, along with a large annuity for her for the rest of her life. Everything I've seen about the youngest James suggests that his heart wasn't really in the nursery. Although he did botanise with his father, he seems to have been much more interested in ornithology and indeed in the history of lead mining. He published a well-received book on European birds in 1890. He was a fellow of the Zoological Society of London, and he wrote an article on lead mining for the Victoria History of Yorkshire, based on his extensive research and collections. In 1896, he published a book on Upper Teesdale, but only 4 of the 87 pages refer to the area's botany, compared to the 16 that are about its birds. He also acted as curator for ornithology at the Yorkshire Philosophical Society, and he recatalogued their ornithology collection in the early 1900s. The horticultural press mentions him rarely. Indeed, it'd be really difficult to understand or to guess at what happened to the nursery after James the Younger's death if you relied only on that sort of reporting. What is clear, however, is that James the Youngest was involved in the decision to make the nursery business a limited company in 1898. The final existing nursery about the narrative about the nursery is that land taxation and the First World War led to the company's financial difficulties. But it's clear that the business was in trouble before the impact of either of these. And in any case, they were very busy laying out rock and other gardens in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, which doesn't suggest a falling off in business. For example, this map is from their 1906 booklet, showing where they'd been active in the previous 12 months. I mean, even if you take it with a pinch of salt, it nonetheless suggests that they were very busy. You know, there hadn't been a falling off of business. I'm not going to go into great detail about the events from 1898 onwards, partly because they're very depressing, and partly because at this time of the evening, and this close to a glass of something nice, I need to be brief. In 1898, James the Youngest sold the Backhouse firm to James Backhouse and Son Limited, lock, stock and plant pot. 51 acres of freehold land, every plant, garden tool, pending contract, debt and all other property and rights were sold for just short of the modern equivalent of £29.4 million, of which half was by the allotment of shares to James, a small portion as preference shares to Mary Louisa, and the remainder as cash to James. James thus bought himself out of almost all the nursery business, although he retained involvement as a director and remained as such until 1914, taking a director's salary. The shares were then put up for sale and people bought them, including head gardeners from across the country and known names in the horticultural world. For a few years, the ordinary shares fared reasonably well, but in 1910, the company approached the High Court for approval for a reduction of their value of almost 50%. A list of the company's outstanding debts at this point is unhappy reading, revealing a mortgage for new nursery land purchased at Cattle between York and Harrogate, a mortgage for land and laboratories created on the edge of the nursery and run by Dr. Arthur Burt, who was the descendant of Thomas that I mentioned when we looked at the family tree right at the outset. And there was a bank charge on the land that the nursery owned in Holgate. The outstanding debts on mortgages, loans, overdrafts and the interest accrued was the modern equivalent of £10.3 million. A year later, the company was borrowing again via the sale of debenture stock to the value of £11.1 million. This was intended to allow the mortgages on the cattle and laboratory sites and the charge on the Holgate land to be paid off. And also in that year, they sold 16 acres of the main nursery site to the Holgate Gardens Estate Society. In August 1914, receivers were appointed, but in 1921, the debenture stockholders prompted a sell-off of Backhouses and all it then possessed. The York site, the tenancy of seed and florist shops in Spurriergate, and the 69 acres at Cattle. Greenhouses, plants and other nursery stock were optional, as was the goodwill of the business. The York site wasn't in the end auctioned off. James Hamilton, who'd earlier bought the house, West Bank, and its associated land from James the youngest after his sister's death, bought what was left of the York Nursery, and his son Alexander ran it thereafter. A new company was set up, Backhouse Nurseries York Limited, which ended any connection between the Backhouse family and the nursery. James the youngest moved to North Wales, and he tried to establish himself as a landscape designer. The company continued to issue catalogues and design gardens in its much reduced state, but finally ceased trading in 1955. Just for a matter of interest, this garden design is next door but one to my best friend from school. And all that remains of it, it's now almost completely tarmacked over, and there's a tree in one corner because they went and looked for me. So it's one of those really strange serendipitous things that happen when you're doing this sort of work. West Bank Park, as some of you will know, had been established as a public park in 1938 when the Hamilton family sold part of the site to the local authority. The rockwork, this wonderful, wonderful rockwork, was bulldozed at some point in the 1960s, apparently. And the park remains the only reminder of what William Robinson so enthusiastically described. I know what happened, but after so much work and finding so much evidence, I still do not fully understand why it happened. And the closer you come to modern times, the more ethically complex it becomes to explore these issues. All I can say at the moment is that my search for understanding continues. So to finish, let's return to the blue plaque and ask what we know now that was not known when it was erected. First, I hope that I've convinced you that both Thomas and James the Younger deserve a much greater part in the historical narratives of the Backhouse Nursery, as developers and managers of the nursery, and in James the Younger's case, as a significant innovator, both of garden form and garden planting. Secondly, in terms of alpine plants, for his introductions and his promotion of alpine planting, James the Younger deserves as much, if not more, recognition as his father. This gentle and much admired man surely deserves to be cradled by gentians. And thirdly, what of the female backhouses? Well, you might say, you've told us that many of them died very young, and you haven't said anything about any of them being involved in the nursery business, and all that is true. But my rejoinder would be that it was the survivors' historically unregarded work as carers that allowed the nursery and other backhouse businesses to flourish. Elizabeth and Sarah, James the eldest sisters, devoted a large part of their lives to bringing up his and Thomas's children, providing them with a stable background without which it's difficult to imagine them achieving what they did as adults. Sarah gave James the elder the idea for the South African school, as we've seen, and managed it thereafter. And it was she who gave us the received version of his life, even if I have spent a fair bit of this evening trying to unpick some of that. Mary Louisa, James the youngest sister, was a very active animal rights campaigner, and I suspect the person who took the photographs of the rockwork and the gardens that we saw earlier. It's interesting to speculate what might have happened to the nursery had she inherited it. These and other York backhouse women deserve a more detailed account of their lives than I've been able to provide here. So my final act tonight is to throw down a gauntlet. I think another PhD calls about these and other York Quaker women, but not this time for me to do. Thank you so much for listening to me talk about this topic, the study of which is not just an academic exercise for me, but which has enriched my life to an extent I really couldn't have imagined when I set out. But the journey hasn't been taken alone. Many people have helped me along the way, and I hope that I've remembered all those associated with the material I've used this evening. Although, as ever, I remain responsible for any sins of omission or commission. So these are the archive staff and resources that I've used. These are the wonderful people who work to keep the few remaining backhouse gardens going and in a decent state to be seen. And this is a very long list of people, and I already know I've missed some people off here, and I'm really sorry. But lots of key individuals who've shared their knowledge and understanding and skills with me. So I hope also that some of my passion for the nursery, its key individuals, and its long-lasting impact has convinced you too of its deserving to be remembered as a business known almost all the world over as Backhouses. Thank you.